where Arab Jews lived then, before, and live now, Arab Jews were around 10% of Judaism. So not a big group. A minority of Jews lived in the Arab world. This was not always the case. For example, in the period of Jewish and Muslim Spain, what we call Al-Andalus, there were many more Jews who lived with Muslims. And in a sense, this was the best period and the best life that Jews had in a Muslim society. And this was not just in Al-Andalus, but this was also true about other centers of Arab Jews. For example, Baghdad. For example, Syria. For example, North Africa. As opposed to the very restrained and constrained life that European Jews had. European Jews suffered a lot from Judeophobia and from, I'm not talking about anti-Semitism, you notice, yeah? But they suffered from a lack of equality and lack of openness of Catholic and later also Protestant societies. So they did not have equality before the law and didn't have equality in the real world either. Arab Jews lived a different life. They were dhimmi, which meant that, like Christians, they were thought by Muslims to be brothers and sisters of Islam. Yeah? So they were people of the book. And as people of the book, in other words, people who come from monotheistic cultures, they were equal to Muslims in many ways. There was only one thing that they needed to do that Muslims didn't, and that is to pay a tax as dhimmi. But apart from that, they had the same rights in most of the Muslim societies. So this is the first contrast that is not admitted in the sources, not the sources you mentioned, of course they talk about it, but the sources you didn't mention, in other words, Ashkenazi sources. So the contradiction you are pointing out is that all the good sources you mentioned are Mizrahi Jews, Arab Jews. And also they're all progressive Jews. And they have a very strong investment in telling the historical story of Mizrahi Jews accurately. Why? Because Zionism did not tell the story accurately. Zionism twisted it and lied. First of all, the reason why Zionism did that is that Zionists are racist. And so when they looked at the Arab Jews from the beginning of Zionism, not from 48 or now, but very early, Herzl, for example, that lived in this city, didn't even know anything substantial about Arab Jews. At some point in time, he didn't even know that they existed. He had no contact with them. He didn't read anything about them. And he did not take them into his calculations about Palestine. And nor did most of the other Zionists from an Ashkenazi background. So you can see that if you compare someone like Herzl or Chaim Weizmann or Ben Gurion or, you know, all these Ashkenazi Jews, for them, the Arab Jews were just Arabs. For them, an Arab was lower than a European. Now, this is, of course, nonsensical because we know that at the height of Al-Andalus, the culture in Al-Andalus was, you know, so high, so much higher than culture in Europe, that without Al-Andalus, the Renaissance would not take place. In Al-Andalus, Jews, Muslims, Christians worked together. They were living in what is now called la convivencia. The convivencia meant that combining the three religious communities gave the society gifts that were not available without that. Yeah? So, for example, an only Jewish society or an only Muslim society or an only Christian society, like in the rest of Europe, was a society that was not complete. Yeah? What do I mean by a complete society? For example, in Al-Andalus, one of the great traditions was translations. And they brought this from Baghdad and from Damascus. Why? Because Islam grows in the 7th century out of Arabia, into Africa, into Asia, into Southern Europe. And in its growth, it takes a lot of cultures into Islam, languages, traditions, different groups of people. And that meant that Islam was a very rich society. The early Islam was very radical in the sense that it ingested cultures and didn't want to change them. It wasn't a narrow empire. The Roman Empire, for example, was a narrow empire. The Holy Roman Empire that came after it was also a narrow empire. Only Christian, only European, only certain languages, like mainly Latin. And so, we think about societies either as narrow, for example, Israel, Zionist Israel, is the narrowest society. Or we can think of societies which are very wide, like India. Yeah, it's got so many gods, so many cultures, so many languages. It's so many ethnicities. Yeah, so this is the first difference, that Jews living in Muslim societies, in other words, under Muslim control, were much more open-minded. First of all, they spoke Arabic like the first language was Arabic. The Jews of Al-Andalus did not speak Hebrew. They did not speak Yiddish like the Jews of Europe. They spoke Arabic. And actually, one of the main creations of Al-Andalus, and I mean the three communities, was the creation of the language of Spain. Yeah? So this language, which we now call Spanish, but it had other names before, is a creation of those three communities. And each of them added words from the background that they came from. So Arabic, Hebrew, and of course Latin, and some other languages close to Latin, Proto-Latin languages, like the languages of what later became Catalonia, and the languages of southern France, all came together to create what we call Spanish. Okay? Now, this was a creation of the society. It didn't come from abroad. It was a totally new language, but it had its roots in many other languages. This is a great creation, yeah? And that meant that there was already an interest in translation, because here you have a three community language. This is the language that connects the communities. And it is related to Arabic. So many words in Spanish starts with AL. Yeah, this is from Arabic.
Algebra, alcohol.
Of course, yeah. A lot of important words. Yeah. Al-Qadi, which is today Alcalde. Alhambra, which was Al-Khamra. Yeah. So we're talking about a whole culture that the language is representing. In other words, the language is representing the three communities that made it.
Equally.
Yeah, equally. Yeah, very equally. Now, that's the simple issue to discuss. Then, Al-Andalus meant, first, translations. What do I mean by that? Everything had to be translated into Arabic and from Arabic, into Hebrew and from Hebrew, into Latin and from Latin. So a number of cities became centers of translation on the model of Baghdad in the 9th and 10th centuries. And Baghdad had the same reason. You know, if you lived in Baghdad under Harun al-Rashid or al-Mamun, then the Arabic tribes that came to Baghdad, built Baghdad, sorry, Baghdad was not there, but the Arabic tribes that came to what was called Babylon, and then built Baghdad very near Babylon, they built a modern city. Baghdad was the most modern city that we can think about. It had a modern plan. It was totally round. It had, a cross. If you look at a map of Baghdad, no city like this ever existed before. It had water channels, canals, modern services. The roads were Roman roads. The water was cleaning, refuse. The whole issue of hygiene was very important. It had huge libraries. There were no libraries in Christianity. The only libraries before, the Christians actually burnt a lot of Greek literature, and of course also Hebrew literature, because these were not Christian, unchristian. While the Muslims were very intellectual in comparison. So Harun al-Rashid and al-Mamun and all the other caliphs that built Baghdad saw their power not in arms or in soldiers, but in books.
So I understand from you, Professor Precious, that they have not a space like a gift. They were a component. Mm-hmm. The Jews, Arab Jews at that time, they were like not a minority. They were part of the society.
They were not treated as a minority. No.
They were like part of the mosaic of the Arab country
totally.
at that time.
Totally.
But in modern times, so since
this has not happened in Europe. For example, the Alhambra was designed by a Jewish architect. Mm-hmm. Many of those Jews were wazirs. They ran the economy, they ran the army. There was no way of treating them like a second-class citizen. Yeah, they ran libraries. The library of the Khalif in Al-Andalus in the 10th century was in itself, there were 61 libraries in Al-Andalus, 61. And if we take the biggest one, which is the Khalif library, it included 100 times more than the rest of Europe.
100 times?
100 times.
Only one library?
One library had 100 times more books than the whole of Europe. Church that had 20 books was a very rich church. I mean, rich intellectually. Yeah. So what Al-Andalus has brought to Europe is something that Europe has never seen. Modern cities, modern urbanity, meaning healthier cities as well. Yeah.
Philosophy, Averroes.
Philosophy, drama, amazing visual culture, cartography. The great navigators could get nowhere without Muslim cartographers, without the art of actually measuring the earth, which actually was a Muslim art. Yeah, so astronomy, of course, in Baghdad was very, very developed. Anatomy, medicine, medications, the whole issue of, you know, 1001 Night was the first book of its kind. Yeah, invented the novel. Yeah, so all kind of things that Europe didn't know existed were brought into the European continent by Al-Andalus. Why am I telling you this story? Because the Jews of Europe and the Jews of the Arab world were not even similar. They were not in contact.